Morning, guys. It's Monday. Hope you had a good weekend. Beautiful weather this weekend. As you can probably tell, I got a little bit of sun. But anyhow, as I told you last week, I was going to do a lecture here on Vietnam. Guys, there is, just doing a search, there's a ton of information on YouTube on Vietnam. I'm going to kind of take you through a timeline. Okay, and some of this I've kind of already introduced. When you look at this map here, here's Vietnam, okay, Cambodia, and Laos, okay, and one of the key factors here is that this war kind of became political. Many members of Congress did not want to see an expansion of the war into Laos and Cambodia. So American troops were not actually allowed to go into Cambodia and Laos. Now we know, looking back, that they did. They weren't supposed to. But here's one of the main reasons why they did kind of violate congressional law here, was this trail right here, guys. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay. I have talked about for a long time in this class when it comes to military and war, talking about supply lines, and the fact that if you can't cut your enemy's supply lines, it makes it more difficult to win. If you can cut their supply lines, well, you're going a long way towards winning. Okay, so the supply lines for the NVA, which is North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong, you find these getting supplies down here through Laos and Cambodia, and then bringing them in across the border. Guys, this is a literal trail. It is not a highway. It's not a road. It's a trail through the jungle. And these weapons and supplies and ammunition are brought in on the backs of human beings. Okay, so people are literally walking this trail of supply line, which made it very difficult to cut that supply line. Okay, so that's going to play a very big role in this. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of start. If I go back here, guys, this is 1954. Okay, so Ho Chi Minh and his followers, the Viet Minh, took to the hills and the jungles in 47. By 54, obviously, they had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu. I talked about that last week, which was here in this photograph. And so after that, they split the country. Now, this is kind of interesting, is that when the French controlled all this region, including Laos and Cambodia, they converted a whole bunch of people to Catholicism, brought them to Christianity. And so knowing the basic tenets of communism is that, religion is not something they want. The government wants people to rely on them, not on God. And so people were allowed to leave the north and go south, okay? But what came with them are a lot of communist sympathizers that infiltrated into the south. Okay, so as I said last week, you never really knew who was Viet Cong and who was, supported the South Vietnamese government. Okay, so as we move through this kind of timeline, guys, you have a situation where this starts with Eisenhower, okay, Ike, okay, that's 1953. So up till 1960, Eisenhower's helping to support the South Vietnamese. President Kennedy's elected in 1960, okay. By 1962, before Kennedy is assassinated, there are 16,000 Americans in South Vietnam, and what they're doing, guys, is training the South Vietnamese army, trying to help them to be able to defeat the Viet Cong and the NVA. And so, we're supplying them weapons, we're supplying them training, and so forth. Our guys would go out on mission with the South Vietnamese army and help them, learn how to practice different tactics, and so forth. Okay, so that when Kennedy was assassinated, the last interview he gave, before he was assassinated. He said that the issue of Vietnam would be settled by Vietnamese men and boys, not American men and boys. Okay, and so that would lead you to believe that, hey, Kennedy did not want to expand Americans' role here. That we would help the South Vietnamese, but we weren't going to get directly involved. Okay, now you can judge for yourself whether having 16 military advisors in country is involved or not. I mean, obviously it is to some extent. Okay, then we move to 1964. Okay, I'm going to point out this right here. Okay, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Okay, there are some American ships that come under attack here by the North Vietnamese Navy. Okay, now the circumstances of this incident, as it is called, are still a little cloudy to this day. Okay, now I watched Vietnam in HD, just kind of studying up on this a little bit, and they seem pretty confident that it happened. So President Johnson, that takes over for Kennedy, basically goes to Congress and asks for permission to send combat troops to Vietnam to aid the South Vietnamese. And that bill passes, okay? That it gives the president, the authority, which he has anyways, to go ahead and send troops, okay? And so we start, pretty small, 25,000, 50,000. Okay, I'll just show you this right here. Few facts, okay? 50,000 Americans served in Vietnam between 60 and 64, okay? And that would be, people training troops and so forth, and then the first combat troops starting to arrive, okay? So that's going to come, it's really going to start to ratchet up after 1964, okay? Now, if you look at some of these dates, now Mekong Delta, that's 1957, that's before us, but that's the South Vietnamese fighting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, okay? And then the last date you're going to see is 1975 here, okay? So what we're looking at is 1965, okay? And this will be our focus early on, is the Central Highlands 1965. And that's where I want to bring up really where we kind of figure out, all right, how we're going to fight this war, okay? And really it's done with the helicopter. And so I don't really have a picture here, but I do want to show you this here. I picked up this website here. This is Military Times, and it's the top 10 best Vietnam War movies, okay? And I'm just going to start with number 1 and work my way through this a little bit if my mouse wants to cooperate. Okay. All right. There we go. And number 1, this is having a hard time loading, but it's got a lot of different video, but is Platoon, 1986. Now, guys, this is obviously, this is rated R. Now, this movie is by Oliver Stone, and he kind of has an agenda with it. It's very much an anti GI soldier movie. It kind of shows the dark side of Vietnam. And guys, this is not based on a true story or anything like that. This is just this is in Oliver Stone's mind. Okay. Maybe I'll go back up here because you can. These have loaded. Well, I think they have. Yeah. So these are Casualty of War 1989. That's Sean Penn. Okay. You recognize this actor here. Okay. This is one I want to talk about most. Is probably We Were Soldiers. A lot of these movies do a poor job of portraying the American soldier. But hush. All right, give me a second here. I got to shut this cat. Okay, so this, you see Mel Gibson here. This movie, he portrays Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, and Moore is strong Catholic man, and this is based on a true story. And he is going to be the lieutenant colonel in charge of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. And they're going to use helicopters, okay? They find out where a large contingent of the NVA is, okay? Here in the Central Highlands, okay? And this is pretty close to the border of Cambodia. But there's, we think there's about, 500 NVA there. Well, it turns out, guys, there's an entire base camp with about 3,000 troops. And so we're going to use helicopters to bring our guys in. And now, you got to watch the movie, or it's very well documented in that World War II HD. Well, we're going to bring the helicopters in. Now, you can only bring in, about 8 guys at a time, and you bring in, 10 helicopters. That's 80 guys. The helicopters go back to base, get 80 more guys, and that takes an hour or so. And so you're dropping these first guys off, and you've got to have a clearing with the helicopters. And so we dropped our guys in there, and it basically ended up being a 3-day battle. Guys, we are talking close quarters combat. This is actually going to be a major victory for the United States. It's the first time and one of the few times where American troops and NVA troops fight on a battlefield, like you would see in World War II hundreds and hundreds of times, okay? You just don't see this happen in Vietnam very often. And so that's what made it difficult. It's a victory, but guess what happens? When they withdraw from the battlefield, so do we. I mean, we won, okay, but then we get back on the helicopters and leave. What prevents the NVA from moving right back into that area? Nothing. Nothing prevents them. Okay, so this became a search and destroy type of warfare, okay, rather than conquering and moving our way up the map, okay. It just doesn't work like that because of the terrain, the jungle, the mountains, and everything else. So really the Central Highlands and the Idrang Valley become basically how we're going to fight this war. We're going to go into an area where we think there's the enemy. We're going to kill as many of them we can, and then we're going to get out. Okay, and this takes place throughout the war. Now, guys, it becomes for lack of a better term, a body count. So we feel like if we can kill enough of them, they'll stop fighting. Okay, and guys, the ratio between North Vietnamese dead and American dead and South Vietnamese dead is like 12 to 1. 12 to 1. Okay? We are kicking their butts, but they just keep fighting. Okay? And so this begins to make it difficult. So what do you need? What does the general need? The General Westmoreland needs more troops. So over time, as we move through 66, 67, 68, we're up to 300,000 troops. You move into 68, we're up over 500,000 troops. Okay, 500,000 troops. Okay, and so basically we kept asking for more and more troops. And we're winning here, okay, but we're not winning. Okay, so probably the biggest event or battle of the Vietnam War is called the Tet Offensive in 1968. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with Vietnamese culture, or Asian cultures to that matter, the biggest holiday of the year is New Year's. Okay, so in China, it lasts a month. In Vietnam, these are based on the lunar calendar. Okay, and so their New Year's is a little bit sometimes offset from what we do January 1st or December 31st. We do New Year's Eve. We do New Year's Day. For those of you that like college football, that's what we do, watch college football, and then the bowl games, and then it's over. New Year's is over. Well, not in Asian cultures, guys. So the Vietnamese New Year is called Tet, okay? And if you talk to some of our Vietnamese students, you'll understand they make a big celebration out of this, and the children love New Year's because they get these little red envelopes, and inside these red envelopes is cash money. Okay, so children tend to get a lot of these during the new year, which is a great time for them. Okay, well, guys, in 1965, 1966, and 1967, there was basically a ceasefire. There was no fighting during Tet. Okay, and so in 68, there were suspicions that the Vietnamese might do something. Okay, the North Vietnamese, I should say. But a lot of our, generals and officers, they went on leave because that's the best time to go on leave when you think there's not going to be any fighting. And what happened in 1968 during Tet was a coordinated effort in over 300 different cities at the same time. There will be attacks, okay? And this is going to create chaos, all right? And so down here in Saigon, okay, which today is Ho Chi Minh City, named after Ho Chi Minh, Hue, okay, many of these towns and cities, okay, Hue is a very large city in the middle of the country. So anyhow, I want to talk about Saigon, okay, because that's the capital of the South. And there in Saigon, we have a lot of American troops. That's where Reuters, the news organization, is based. That's where the U.S. Embassy is, okay? And so that day when the attack started during Tet, they overran the U.S. Embassy. They blew a hole in the wall. They entered the embassy. Well, Reuters, which, is the news service, they have cameras there, and they're filming this chaos, okay? And this, these images are all sent back via satellite back to the United States. So this is what people are watching on TV, on the news every night. And the news coverage, these news shows are 30 minutes long, the nightly news. There's no cable news, guys. So you're ABC, CBS, NBC, basically. And so this chaos back in Vietnam, and they're like, holy cow, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is we were caught off guard. But guys, within 3 weeks, the United States had taken back every city, town that the NVA and the Viet Cong had attacked. Okay? In the end, the Tet Offensive is a major U.S. victory. Okay? But the way it's portrayed back home is not good. It's portrayed as we've lost control in Vietnam and so forth. And there's a moment that historians kind of look back at and say, this is a real turning point. And we start talking about the news and the media. Well, guys, the most trusted man in America in 1968 was a man named Walter Cronkite. Okay, he is a news anchor, and he's a journalist. And what is his job? His job is to tell people the news every day. Okay, that's what he does. He has a good style. People like him. He's trustworthy and so forth. Well, guys, journalists are not supposed to give their opinion. Any of you guys that took Mr. Long and journalism and so forth, you're supposed to report the news. Well, during one of these nightly broadcasts, shortly after the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite takes off his glasses, kind of rubs his nose, and says, I just don't see there's any way we can win this war. Okay? That's giving your opinion, okay? But a lot of people trusted him. And so the faith in our mission there, which the silent majority supported stopping the spread of communism, helping the South Vietnamese people, public sentiment started to turn by the middle of 1968. And this is where you start to see a very loud minority. We saw this in government class when we talked about the 1968 Democratic Convention, which turned to chaos. This is August of 68 in Chicago. And then you start seeing the massive, or a lot of protests. I wouldn't say massive protests. I say a massive amount of protest by a minority of people. You understand? But it's a very loud minority. And so what does the news cover? The news covers these protests. And so this is what you see every day. The majority of Americans still in 1968 supported our efforts in Vietnam, okay? But that is going to start to change, okay? So in 68, Nixon gets elected. Nixon wants to end this thing, okay? Kind of like we ended the Korean Wars, just, hey, can we get a ceasefire, have the two countries divided, that sort of thing? Well, guys, the communists are not folding here. They are not coming to the peace table. So if you look here, we are going to try and bomb, you got U.S. air raids 66 to 73, U.S. air raids here, Operation Rolling Thunder. We're going to try and bomb them into submission, okay? And so that's not going to work. There are some major battles we talk about. This is Khe Sanh in 68. And like at Dien Bien Phu, the Americans are kind of surrounded at this air base in Khe Sanh. And it's a tough battle. And we're having to drop in supplies. They're surrounded. It's ugly. A lot of Americans are going to die. Okay. So this is one of the major battles that's talked about a lot of time. Okay. Other things, Da Nang, Pleiku, Dak Tu, these are major battles, okay? Now, I do want to talk about My Lai, okay, and that's on here. Now, this is a small village. It's not a big city like Hue. We had a really bad incident there. And, well, let's just call it what it was. It's called the My Lai Massacre. And so our troops, guys, you have to understand, they are, they're in the bush. They're in the jungle, okay? The enemy is anywhere and everywhere. They use booby traps, okay? Mines, okay? You're walking through the jungle and all of a sudden you hear an explosion. One of your guys just stepped on a mine and he's bleeding out. It's awful, okay? And then you're in the jungle and there's an ambush, and all of a sudden machine gun fire starts coming from all different angles, okay? And you're just firing at anything that moves into the jungle. And then it starts raining, okay? And there's bugs. There's poisonous bugs, insects, snakes. And then it stops raining, and then the sun comes out, and it's baking hot. It's 100 degrees. It's humid. It's 100% humidity. And then you're ambushed again. Okay, and then that's day one. Day two, what goes on? So, similar stuff. You're on search and destroy missions, and it starts to play tricks on the mind because you don't know where your enemy is. Okay, so you go into these villages. Some of these villages support the Viet Cong. They're hiding weapons there. Some of these villages are scared to support the Americans or the South Vietnamese because they know they'll be killed by the Viet Cong when we leave. And so these villages, we go into them looking for weapons because we want to, get control of their supplies and so forth. And sometimes these people turn on you. And so there's this one unit that went into My Lai, and the commander had he freaked out. In this village were young children, women, and old men, because most of the young men are all off fighting. Okay, on one side or the other. And so they go in this village, and basically the commander gives a kill order to kill everybody in the village. Okay, and it's gut-wrenching, it's awful, and it starts to become a massacre. There's a helicopter pilot above, and he sees kind of what's going on down there. And so he lands his helicopter right in the middle of the village and tries to put a stop to it. In the end, I think it's around 500 people were massacred. Now, the thing is, we tried to cover it up. The commander, said, anybody says anything about this, you're going to die, and it's horrible, guys. So in the end, it took about 13 months before it was found out. that this happened, and then the media found out that it happened. And of course, they're going to talk a lot about it, which really starts to turn more people against the war. And this is where that term baby killer starts to come in, okay? Where these protesters are referring to our soldiers as baby killers, all right? There was marijuana use. There was a lot of alcohol. These guys would get maybe, 2 days of leave a month, where they would get to go blow off some steam. It's an easy to portray our troops in a negative light because of the actions of a few, but the vast majority of our soldiers did not behave this way, okay? Were there rapes of women? Yes, okay. Did sometimes innocent civilians get killed through no fault of their own? Yes, okay, by our troops, all right? But the vast majority of our troops did behave admirably under extremely difficult situations. Now, here's the thing. You're going over there for a year. Okay, you got 12-month deployment. You come home. You might be sent back. So some people do, several deployments. Some people volunteer for those deployments because once you're just in that, in the mix of war, we see this with Iraq war veterans and Afghan veterans. They want to go back because they want to be with their guys, And so as this thing drags in to 1970, 72, we're trying everything possible to win. And it just doesn't, there's nothing we can do, it seems, to win. And so Nixon's trying to get out. And so by 1972, we start pulling troops out. Okay. Now the last troops are not going to leave until 1975. Okay, and guys, when we do leave, the North is going to infiltrate the South and defeat the South. Okay, and so all of Vietnam will become communist, and is to this day. Okay, now one of the things I want to mention, I have this name over here, a guy named No Dinh Diem. He was the leader of South Vietnam, and guys, he wasn't a very good leader. He wasn't a very good human being. Another thing that happened is one of his generals. And there's cameras rolling, guys. The media's there, and they found this Viet Cong. He's a teenager down in Saigon, and they walk him out of a building, and one of Diem's generals just puts a gun to his head and drops him right there in front of the cameras. And so that's shown back in the United States, and people are like, "Whoa, man, this is crazy." And so eventually we're gonna leave, and the South is going to be overrun. Okay, this is going to lead to some serious problems for anybody that fought. If their families, if their sons, if their fathers fought for the South Vietnamese army, well, when the communists come in, they're going to come looking for those people. They're going to come looking for those people that helped the U.S. while we were there, at our bases and so forth. They're going to become targets of the communists. So a lot of these folks will start to try and flee the country, okay? And this is a problem because when you flee Vietnam, if I come back to this map, okay, you get, where are you going? Where are you going to go? Okay, you don't want to go to Cambodia, okay? It's chaos there too, okay? So you get on a boat, okay, and you try and make it to Malaysia, okay, or Indonesia, okay? This is where you're trying to get. Now, guys, this looks small on a map, but it's not small in reality. Okay, it's the South China Sea. And so these are what we refer to as Vietnamese boat people. Now, as we're pulling out of Vietnam, guys, we're trying to take as many of these folks that helped us as possible. So the last planes out, the last cargo planes out, are packed with Vietnamese people, trying to get them out. The last Navy ships leaving are packed with Vietnamese people trying to get them out. One of the interviews I had last year, Cale Blasey, he was trying to find somebody to interview, and I knew Ron, and I know Ron hasn't been at school in a long time. He's one of our maintenance guys. I knew that Ron was a Vietnam vet, and so I asked Ron, I said, "Hey, can one of my students interview you?" And so I went ahead and sat in on the interview because I'd gotten to be pretty good friends with Ron, and just kind of wanted to hear his story. And so let me just kind of tell you that story, and I'll cut this video off in a few minutes here. So Ron got in some trouble with the law. I mean, nothing really bad, but the judge said you can go to jail for 60 days or you can join the Army and go to Vietnam. And Ron said, I'll go to Vietnam. And so he went to basic training and then was sent over there. And this is in 1970, I think 72, okay? And he said when he got there, within 3 days, 3 of his best friends that he went through basic with were dead, okay, within 3 days. Ron was one of the last soldiers to leave Vietnam, and he left on a ship, a Navy ship. And when he talked about this in his interview, he said, this is probably the hardest, the memories that I have worst. They were pushing helicopters and $1 million aircrafts off the ships just to make room for human beings, for the Vietnamese. And the decks were packed. The interior of the ship was packed with people. I mean, but more and more people kept trying to get on the ship, and they're bringing their boats up to the ship and trying to climb on the ship, and there's no more room. And he said they were ordered to start firing on those boats so that they wouldn't try and get to the ship. And he said, watching that, and I'm not sure if he had to do that, and I think he might have had to shoot at those boats. He says one of the hardest things, and he said that was the worst thing about the whole time in Vietnam, not the fighting, but the leaving. Just a really sad story, and I know it really affects Ron to this day. But so what we're going to see, guys, and this is okay. So we have a lot of Vietnamese students at our school. Okay, so most of them, and I've been teaching at Carroll for 20 years, and I've had a lot of these Vietnamese students. And the vast majority, I love you guys, okay? I mean, you're awesome kids and awesome families. And, you know, I mean, every now and then you get a student that, you know, kind of bugs you. But I've always enjoyed having you guys in my classes and your stories and your parents' stories. And they're amazing to me. I mean, I had to do an interview in college similar to the assignment you did. Or maybe doing. And I interviewed a woman named Tram Gleason. At the age of 19, Tram was living in Vietnam, and her brother had died actually fighting for the South Vietnamese Army in the Tet Offensive. Her parents owned a restaurant, and but she wanted to get out of there. So she got on a boat, about a 25-foot boat with 36 people. And they set sail in the South China Sea. Okay. Now, one of the fears that these Vietnamese boat people had were pirates. You had these pirates from Thailand they knew these people were desperate. And so what would you take with you if you were going on a boat? Well, you try to take anything valuable, like jewelry, okay, money, so that you'd have, you know, something to bargain with wherever you landed. For your livelihood. These people couldn't take bunch of suitcases with them. These boats are packed with human beings, and they're more important than belongings. So the pirates knew that these people would have valuables on them, and so they would go out there and look for these boats that were fleeing Vietnam. Sometimes they would kill the people. They would rape the women. That was the biggest fear. It wasn't the ocean. It was the pirates. Okay, and so they were being pulled, and she was 19 and a woman, so she was down in the bottom of the boat, hiding, and some pirates got them. Now, thankfully, they didn't kill anybody, but they ended up stealing their fuel as well, and so they're afloat out here in the middle of the South China Sea. And she said this Muslim boat came along with Muslims in it, and they towed them to Indonesia. Now, in Malaysia and Indonesia, guys, they have basically camps for these people that are fleeing, these refugees, refugee camps. And at the camp she was taken to, there was the Wichita Diocese had a presence there. And so they were taking these people from the refugee camps, and most of them stayed about a year in these refugee camps. And they were being sent to Canada, Australia, and the United States. Okay? And Tram had met this really nice man in the refugee camp, and he was going to Canada, and she wanted to go with him. But she had the cough. The cough was tuberculosis. Okay? Canada and Australia would not take people with the cough, but the United States would. Okay? And so she was sponsored by the Wichita Diocese to come back to Wichita, Kansas. Okay? And here she met an American. She got a job at Boeing, had to learn English, didn't speak a word of English, got a job at Boeing, met an American man, and eventually got married. And, you know, she talks about how her faith really helped her through those days on that boat, you know. And so it was an amazing story. The interview went on for about an hour. And so she said, I'm sending my kids to Catholic school. And so she sent her kids through there, as a lot of our Vietnamese families do. Okay, but if you didn't know this, a lot of our Vietnamese students are second generation, so their parents were the first ones to come from Vietnam. And I've heard a lot of these different stories over time. Some that were in POW camps in Vietnam that the U.S. government helped get out. One of them was a doctor. And so he came in on a plane, but a lot of them came by boat, okay, and became refugees. And that's kind of a good story to give you an idea of what our Vietnamese families have gone through, okay, to get to freedom, to escape communism, okay. So I just have this, this is some good statistics and so forth, shows you here, 9 million persons served on active duty during Vietnam era, so 64 to 75. Now, not all those people went overseas. 3,400,000 served in Southeast Asia, okay, flight crews, Thailand sailors, so forth, and 514,000 offshore. That meant they were on the ground. 7,484 women served in Vietnam, 6,250 were nurses, 8 nurses died, 1 killed in action. Vietnam veterans represented 9.7% of their generation, which is a lot smaller than World War II. Okay, 240 men were awarded the Medal of Honor, okay, which is a lot. Okay. Hostile deaths, 47,000. Non-hostile deaths, 10,000. MIA, missing in action, 2,300. POW, prisoner of war, 766. This many died in captivity. Wounded in action, 300,000. Okay. Severely disabled, you can see here, 75,000 severely disabled, 23,000 with 100% disability. Lost limbs, amputations, multiple. Married men killed, 17,000. Under the age of 21, 61%. Average age of men killed, 22.8 years old. Vietnam veteran to date, Vice President Al Gore. Federal Express, okay, head was and then 79% of men who served in Vietnam had high school education or better. I mean, that means, 21% did not. Suicide rate of veterans within the 1.7 norm of the general population. Okay, just some interesting statistics. To talk about this today real quick, guys, Vietnam today and the United States have resumed normalized relations, okay? And, talking to Long Ta a little bit last year, who was from Vietnam, that was that name I couldn't remember the other day. Long talked about how support of the Americans, or people liking the United States and Vietnam is very high, even though we went through all this with them. And they're still communists, but they fear China. Okay. And so we've seen American trade with Vietnam. American Navy has naval vessels have, again, docked in Vietnam. It's kind of strange. So things have improved. Guys, there's so much I could talk about with this. You talk about people like John McCain, who ran for president. He served in a prisoner of war camp. Incredible story, guys. He was shot down in the first couple years of the war and was tortured. He broke his arm when he ejected from his aircraft, and they would let it heal, and then they would break it again. John McCain's father was an admiral in the Navy, and when the North Vietnamese found out about that, they offered to let him out, and they thought they would use him as propaganda. And so he refused to leave his other men behind and stayed, I think, a full year and a half being tortured. They wanted our POWs to admit guilt. They wanted our POWs to admit to war crimes. And these guys were tortured not to go on video saying that sort of thing, okay? Now, here's a name I'm going to drop for you here, and her name is Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda was against the Vietnam War. She's a famous actress from a famous acting family, the Fonda family. And she went over to North Vietnam, sat in anti-aircraft guns that were shooting down our planes in protest of the Vietnam War. And so people took to calling her Hanoi Jane, okay? And to this day, her name is mud among those that supported our efforts there, those that served there. Most of them despise this woman. Now, guys, one thing I just want to talk about briefly, I'm sorry, this has gone a long time, but when our soldiers got home, there was no victory, obviously. Many of them were severely mistreated by people in this country. When they got back, people would spit on them. They would call them baby killers. Total disrespect for our soldiers. We know some of them didn't behave well, but as I said earlier, the vast majority of them did. And it was really hard on these veterans. Today, I think, most Americans really support our Vietnam vets, all of our vets. And I think they've received the recognition and love and adulation of the American people. So as they begin to really age, I think a deep respect, at least for me and people I know. Coach Lawbon was one of those guys. He was one of the guys getting on and off the helicopters. And he doesn't talk about it. I've known him for 20 years, and he'll drop little hints, little sayings, and talk about being late, and if the helicopters are late, people are going to die. Don't be late. It's a tough thing. He was a Ranger, and so he was one of those guys. So Vietnam continues to be a controversial war. Whether you think to stop the spread of communism was a good idea. Definitely how we fought the war didn't work. There are people who believe we could have won. There are people that think there's no way we would have ever won. Okay, so I'll leave it up to you to do your own research on this. Some of you guys have read things we've carried. We go back to these movies real quick. Okay, this one is pro-American. Hamburger Hill, these are violent. Born on 4th of July is a pretty good movie. Tom Cruise, Good Morning Vietnam. A little humor added in with it. Full Metal Jacket, wow. That's a pretty crazy movie. Deer Hunter is dark. So is Apocalypse Now. It's a very dark movie. And then so is Platoon, okay, which is probably the most famous of these movies. But my favorite is We Were Soldiers. And this is based off a book that one journalist was embedded with these guys at the Ia Drang Valley. And he wrote a book called We Were Soldiers and We Were Young. or we were young and we were soldiers. So, all right, guys, I'm going to let you go. I'm at 45 minutes. I'll pick up with the next lecture tomorrow. Okay, have a good one.